Welcome to Semi-Sages of the Pages, the writing podcast where we're not sure where we're going, but we're having an adventure.
This podcast contains adult themes and language at times.
At times? What fun is that?
And discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to Semi-Sages of the Pages. We are so lucky today to be doing our second author interview, and we're here with a brilliant science fiction writer named Kurt Pankau, and he's going to tell us all about not only his work and what he's doing, but he's going to share with us some tips and tricks to make our writing tighter, to work with our dialogue, and to really make final edits that can make our stories more powerful for the readers. Molly, do you want to say anything before we have him introduce himself?
Sure. I want to say two things. One, it's just Morgan and I this time. It's not because we don't love Teresa and Sarah. We do. We just don't want to overwhelm this kind of interview format with too many people. Also, I want to say I got the opportunity to meet Kurt at the Flight of Foundries conference, and he gave me some really good feedback. And then we've gotten a chance to read a couple of his stories. I really love them, so I'm excited about this interview.
So the reason Molly and I got to interview you, Kurt, will tell you the behind scenes part. Before I had met you and listened to your brilliant analysis on, what did you call your seminar again? The 50 Shades of Grey one?
It was 50. It was putting the words in the right order, a 50 Shades line editing demonstration.
Yeah. And I was so excited. I got to help volunteer at Flights of Foundry. So I also got to meet you behind the scenes and then take that. And I was so excited that right then I asked you if you would be on our podcast. And I went to Molly and she's like, "Oh, that's amazing. I have this other guy I really, really want to work with. He gave me the most incredible feedback. So intelligent, such a great writer." And it was the same person.
Well, I am extremely flattered.
We were so excited. So, I mean, I think that'll tell our listeners how blown away. I mean, the Flights of Foundry was such a brilliant and wonderful opportunity, and it was free and people were so passionate. But for me, you really stood out as someone who understood writing craft and the importance of, like you were talking about, line by line editing, but also I think from reading your work, I'm really, really inspired by your use of tempo and your ability to get tone across. So hopefully we'll talk about all those things. So,
well, why don't we have Kurt introduce himself?
Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you, Molly.
Hi, I'm thrilled to be here. My name is Kurt Pankau. I write mostly sci-fi, a lot of it silly. I've had a dozen odd pieces placed various and sundry places around the web, Nature Futures, Daily Science Fiction, Escape Pod, a handful of other places. I am a slush reader for Diabolical Plots. And what else do you need to know about me?
Can you tell us more about Diabolical Plots? Because I don't know much about that.
Certainly. It's a professional short story market. They now everything is topsy-turvy this year because of the ongoing plague, but they typically will open in July for submissions, and then they purchase 24 stories and run 2 stories a month throughout the year. It's run by David Steffen, and he has a handful of slush readers. Do you guys know anything about the slushing process or how short story market?
Not in short stories. I would love to hear more about short stories. I think we have a lot of people are interested in that, but I know very little.
Okay, so there are a lot of short story markets right now. It's kind of a short story mini renaissance going on. It's not like the old days, like in the Hubbard and Heinlein and Asimov, where you could kind of make a living off of short stories. But especially with the rise of podcasting, there are a lot of audio first markets that are looking for snippets of information, even some of the snippets of information, shorter stories that can be presented as a standalone. Even some of the more established and prestigious markets will podcast some of their episodes as well. So There's a lot out there. The SFWA guidelines consider anything that pays at least 8 cents a word to be a professional market. And so you have your big ones are like Asimov's, Clark's World, Strange Horizons, fantasy and science fiction. And then there's a lot of so those are like the big heavies, and then there's the less prestigious but still very exciting markets like Beneath Ceaseless Skies. There's any of the escape artists sister podcasts, so Escape Pod, which is where I've been published, but they also have Pseudopod, which is their horror podcast, or Podcastle, which is their fantasy imprint, and then they've got a Cast of Wonders, I think, is their other one, and that is more YA oriented. So go ahead.
Can I ask you, if someone's new to any genre, but specifically this genre, is there a place where you can find all this information, or did you just kind of stumble upon one thing and then another, or what's the best advice you have for that?
There are a handful of places. The one that I use is called the Submission Grinder. I don't know if you have show notes, we can make links available, but it's thegrinder.diabolicalplots.com. It is run by David Steffen, who runs Diabolical Plots, and basically it's a web app where you can create an account for free and keep a log of your stories and what their word counts are, and then do a search, and it will come back with results. Usually you can, I think by default they're ordered by how much they pay per word, and so they'll have maybe a little blurb about what that market is looking for. It's a really useful tool, and because so many of the markets don't want simultaneous submissions and they don't want multiple submissions, they basically want one story to go to them and not be going to anyone else at the same time. And if they have a story of yours, they don't want anything else from you at the same time. So it gets to be a little bit of I was going to say, it gets to be a little bit of a Tetris thing to try to figure out where things go.
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
Yeah, yours. I was going to say you were starting to ask something.
Oh, I was going to say I had a friend who is also writes short story, science fiction, also kind of has a comedy edge to it. And he's gotten published in things like The Colored Lens, and yeah, what you're talking about is familiar to me, because he had to have like this master spreadsheet. And for him, it was like, it was never just one story at a time that he was putting out. It was like, okay, he was working 5 or 6 at the same time, because like you said, if he's feeding one story to one place, he can't put that anywhere else. And he can't, like, that place doesn't want more than one story from him at the same time. So that was kind of his solution. Yeah,
that's really the best way to do it. If you want to have sales, you really have to take kind of a shotgun approach. You finish your story, you get someone that you trust to look at it and get you some feedback, and then you send it out into the world. And so and then you get on to the next one, because it can be a very time-consuming process. And this is true for people that have been doing this for years and have sold a lot of stories. You mostly get rejections. It's really less about, it's not like a job interview where you just go in and you're like, hey, I'm wonderful. Here's this thing that I produced. And they're like, we love it. We will buy it. Here's money. It's almost more like trying to get into a relationship where it really needs to be the right story with the right editor and the right time, because sometimes you get rejected because, like, we love this story, we would totally buy it, except we just bought one that's very similar to it and we can't run 2 of them that close to each other. So you can't be precious about individual stories. You just have to send them off. And I talk to people that have some of their favorite stories that maybe they sell on their 25th submission, and that's great.
So can I clarify, just for our listeners and for myself? So you have one story, and since you don't send it out to multiple magazines or multiple publications at a time. You're going to do one, and then you can't. And then when you get the rejection, you do the next one. And so that's what you're talking about by the time it hits its 25th or 60th rejection or whatever it is. It's literally, you've had to wait for those rejections. So how long does a typical rejection take? And do they always respond, or do they ever just like sit on your work and not get back to you?
And this is something where the submission grinder is actually really useful because it's got a lot of self-reported data where you can see a graph of where you are, and like, here's this block of all these submissions, and the red ones have been rejected, and the purple one is yours, and the green ones have been accepted, and the blue ones haven't been touched yet. And so you can kind of see kind of where you are in the process. So someplace like fantasy and science fiction will turn things around very quickly. It's not uncommon to get a 2 or 3 day rejection there. Whereas something like, it's not Asimov's, it's the other one that starts with an A. My mind is going blank. Analog. It's much more likely to take months. And it's useful to know that going in, and all of that information is going to be available on the grinder. And there's other places like that. I think Duotrope is another one that a lot of people use. So they have very different interfaces. You just find the one that's comfortable, but it's typically good to keep the same one because that will have all of your information, so you don't have to re-enter it.
Well, something that I think is really interesting about the short story market right now is there's so many options for where you can put your short story. Like, there are, the traditional kind of publications. There are new publications coming up every day. Like you said, now there are podcasts and like the Escape Pod, things like that. I have a friend who sold their story to a game, like an RPG game, who are going to take his story and then put it's a timeline for one of their games and structure for one of their games. And then even that, like, plenty of people, write their own blogs, publish their stories that way, start their own podcasts. I have no idea why someone would want to do that. People start YouTube. Like, there are so many ways to get your story out if that's what you want to do. Or is that completely off the mark? Because I'd love to hear your opinion on that, Kurt.
On like publishing your own stuff,
on your options for getting your story out, and if there are more options, or if it just feels like that to me.
There are a lot, and there are aggregators that will bring them to your attention. So you don't discover short story magazines by seeing them on the rack at your local bookstore. You discover them by knowing someplace that puts up a listing. And there are a lot. You see a lot of anthologies kickstarted, and people will put an anthology on Kickstarter and say, "Hey, if we can raise $5,000, then we'll put this out." And so there's again, kind of to what I was saying closer to the beginning, is that there it is kind of a renaissance in short fiction going on right now, especially speculative fiction.
That's really exciting. That's like really hopeful. I feel like a lot of times what we hear is kind of the opposite. Like, we're getting 500 queries per week, and, you may or may not hear back. So I really like that perspective. And what do you think is the difference between kind of what draws a writer to the novel or short story market? Or do you think there's a difference?
It really comes down to what your story is. I have a lot of novel idea stories as well. And I've gotten pretty good at sussing out, okay, given like the size of this ending and the scope of this story, is this something that I can fit in 4,000 words? Or is this something that really needs to be closer to 30,000 words? And if it's going to be 30,000 words, that's novella length. There's really not a lot of novella markets. So would it make more sense to try to flesh it out to like 80,000 words and start so I can put it on query as a novel? So a lot of people do both. This is true even of published, I should say, but like professional novelists. I think it's about an even split of those who got their start in short fiction and those who got their start in novels. So I think the nice thing about short fiction is basically the shorter a story is, the freer you are to experiment. You can, and there's a pretty wide breadth of short fiction that you can put out there. So like Escape Pod, they want between 2,000 and 6,000 words. If you're writing flash fiction, so that's going to be stuff that's under 1,000, you really can't submit it to them. But then there's markets like daily science fiction, which are looking for up to 1,500 words. And so there's other markets that will take up to 17,000 words, which is, I think, considered a novelette. So, you gotta look through and see, what these different markets want. If it's generally a good idea to kind of tailor your word count to sellability. If you are interested in getting into short stories, it's really hard to sell a 9,000 word thing because it's too long for most markets, but it's too short for the novella markets. There are not a lot of novella markets, but there is a lot of novella product on Amazon because it's a pretty good length to self-pub at.
Oh, that's really helpful. So when you're deciding between your short story and your novel, and you talked about that.
Actually, can I
jump in?
Do you mind? Yeah, sorry. So Kurt, you made something that an interesting point that I really liked, but I want to make sure it hits home for our readers. So I'm wondering if you can expand on it just a little bit. When you talked about experimenting and the freedom to experiment when you're writing something short, can you give some examples so that readers kind of know what you mean?
Yes. Let me.
Or listeners, not readers.
So,
yeah.
listeners,
Sorry.
hopefully the listeners are also readers. So one of my favorite stories that I have ever read is a flash fiction piece. So it's probably about 800 or 900 words, and it is called All 9,203 Episodes of How I Met Your Broodmother Ranked. And it was written by Jen Reese, and it is a listicle. And it is hilarious, and it is extremely dark. Like every item in that is a gut punch that will just make you laugh out loud. And it does not have a traditional story structure. But it works because it's very short. There is a piece that ran in Flash Fiction Online called I Am Gralnak of the Vroon Empire, Destroyer of Galaxies, Supreme Overlord of the Planet Earth. Ask me anything.
Ask me anything.
And it is formatted as a Reddit AMA thread.
Wow.
And
that's fantastic.
And again, Flash Fiction Online only takes things up to 1,000 words. So even if I don't know the precise word count, I know that it is under 1,000 words. And you would be very hard pressed to stretch a premise out like this to 2,000 or 3,000 words. But in this kind of a bite-sized chunk, it works just brilliantly. And that is by Laura Perlman, is that story.
Well, and I think there's also okay, so if you're going to write a novel length piece, there's a lot of, that's a big commitment, energy and time wise.
It is. You end up putting a little bit of your soul into a novel.
And if you have a premise that you're like, I'm not sure that this premise is, I should write 80,000 words about the squirrel in my backyard. I don't know, or squirrel astronaut, or now I'm writing SpongeBob. If you have something like that, and you're not sure, like you said, it's a great way to experiment, to write a short story about it.
That kind of segues into my question, if you lump this in, which is when you're deciding what's appropriate length for the idea, do you have any questions that you ask of the idea that is, like a little formula that helps you kind of know how?
It's more of a gut feeling than a formula, but
okay.
The first thing that I think about is how big is the ending, because big endings require a lot more setup, which means it's going to require a lot more word count. Now there's always exceptions. There are very short stories that manage to have some big endings, but just when I'm thinking about things, that's the first question I ask myself. The other question is cast. Actually, I think Mary Robinette Kowal has a formula that she uses for hers that's like number of locations times 1,000 plus number of named characters times 500 equals projected word count or something like that.
Huh.
And I don't do anything that granular, but I usually have an idea of how long it can be. But I also will typically have a market in mind. If I'm like the most recent story that I finished, I was specifically thinking of the escape artists, and they have an upper tier of 6,000 words. And so if I submit it there, then there's lots of other markets that can accept it with that. But I was making a conscious decision as I was kind of formulating out the plot beats in my mind about what kind of a word count I was really shooting for. So just a pro tip, the ability to write to a word count is a very useful skill to develop.
We talked about that. We did an episode about genres. We talked about word count. And yeah, when you get to novel length, you have more space to play, but you don't have as much place to play as you think you do.
That's
no,
so true.
You really don't. And it really depends on the genre too.
Yeah.
Like if you were to try to write 120,000 word murder mystery,
Nope.
Hard pass. That's about twice as long as it needs to be.
Right.
Romances tend to be shorter. Epic fantasy tends to be longer, but that's changing. There's more of a market for narrower scope epic fantasy lately. So
I'm so glad you talked about kind of focusing your idea like on your audience as you craft it, because I think that that's really helpful and really important. So once you kind of get those two things together, do you have motivational issues? Like, what's your process like? Can you sit down and crank it out relatively quickly, or do you have to be inspired?
I can write pretty quickly. I spent 2 years writing a piece of flash fiction every week. And that was as a kind of a motivator. There were a number of things going on behind that. And at the time I was publishing them on my blog. I have since taken them down. The ones that I still find readable, I put on Curious Fictions every now and then, or put in my newsletter. But that was 100 stories over the course of 2 years. And that was, it was great practice at writing beginnings and writing endings and kind of feeling out a plot, even if I didn't have a lot to go on. But really it was the discipline of, you have a deadline, you've made a commitment, and people are going to start, tapping on your door if you don't deliver on that commitment. Not literally. I'm not popular enough to have stalkers yet, but still. Because anybody can do the work when they're inspired. It's really training yourself to be able to do it when you're not. And that's another good skill to develop. There was another part to that question that I'm trying to remember what I was going to say too.
I was just asking about like when do you hit ruts, kind of like, or have you just trained yourself to push through it? So that
usually if I hit a rut or if I hit writer's block or something like that, that is an indicator to me that there is something that I don't like about the story that I need to figure out. Because it's boring or it feels artificial. And so that becomes a reason for me to take a different tack towards the story about maybe I need to revise. Do I even have an outline? Maybe I need one. Do I need to reconsider this character's motivations? I mean, for the most part, I'm pretty good about fighting through it, but I generally will do enough prep work that by the time I sit down to actually start writing, I can usually fly through it very quickly. I've learned about myself that I work best when I am able to build and maintain momentum. Mm-hmm. And if that is 2,000 words a day or 1,000 words a day, then the fact that I just keep going, that is what really enables me to finish. Because if I get if I get 10,000 words into a novel project and then stop to work on something else, it is very difficult for me to transition back into it. But the first rule of writing advice is your mileage may vary. So just because it works for me doesn't mean it will work for you. And just because it has worked for you in the past doesn't mean it will ever work for you again.
But I think there was a really powerful piece of writing advice that I'd never heard before. And I'm going to say it a different way and see if you agree with it, if I took it the right way. If you're stuck and you kind of are forcing yourself to have to write, it might be that you have a kind of, what I heard was it like a developmental edit, a bigger story edit issue that you need to look at.
Yeah, that's frequently true. Or maybe you're just bored of it. And if you're bored of it, then your readers will probably be bored of it. So
I want to. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I was just going to say, it really is when you find yourself not wanting to work on the thing, that may be an indicator that there is something wrong with it that you can go in and fix. And you just need to really change the way you're thinking about it. Now, it may also be an indicator that the world is on fire and you have no motivation to do anything. And it's amazing that you got out of bed in the morning. There's been a lot of that going around lately. So again, your mileage may vary.
Amen.
And I wanted to also point this out. This was really interesting to me. So I kind of I plot light. I'll say that. I do a little bit of outlining, that kind of stuff, but I'm not a heavy outliner. And I found I have to do some outlining because otherwise it just goes nuts. But I was talking to some people who are kind of, they consider themselves pantsers or don't outline at all. And there is a phenomenon, I guess I'm going to say phenomenon, that some people feel that once the story has gotten developed enough and they've told the story enough that the story is clear in their heads, it becomes boring to them.
That is a real true thing. And people that describe themselves as pantsers, that's a big motivation of why they prefer to write that way. So I am kind of in between. For short stories, I usually don't have a firm outline as long as I have a very clear concept of the character arc, because that gives me something to write towards. I tend to outline novel projects more heavily, making sure that I know going into a chapter, because again, for me, it's about momentum. So anything I can do to keep me from having to stop is important. So I will have all of the chapters, the plot beats that need to happen in that chapter, the perspective character for that chapter, if it's a multi-perspective project. And then the actual writing of the chapter is much more of a discovery writing thing where I know I need to hit these things, but I don't exactly know how I'm going to do it.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I'm like one of those, I have milestones, right? I know where the milestones are. I know what happens at the milestones in general, but I'm not exactly sure how I'm getting from milestone A to B. Yeah. And that's the discovery part, but it more keeps me on track though.
So obligatory caveat is that I have not yet sold a novel. I have sold a number of short stories. So it's entirely possible that I have no idea what in regards to novels, but I think I do. So.
Kurt, do you think that is there a difference in the competition level, or is it that serendipity that you're talking about where it's all about finding the right person at the right time for the right project?
It really is that, but at the same time, like I know people that have had novels on Query, and it is a heartbreaking process because your novel is so much more of you. I've written literally hundreds of short stories. I can take or leave most of them, but a novel project that sticks with you. That's an investment of time. It's an investment of yourself. And so you have a lot more emotionally invested in the success or failure of that. So it's much more emotionally draining.
I mean, Morgan and I certainly aren't on Query right now. And we have no idea what you're talking about.
We haven't had a full request in for a month and a half, and pick up the phone every second. Anyone rings going, oh, please.
I mean, the nice thing about when you've got novels out on sub to agents or whatnot is that at least you can have your sub to multiple agents at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
They treated
And
it
there
like the
was
short story
something-
market to be
There
interminable.
was something like when I got my full request, there was something amazing about that. That even if I don't go any further, that was cool for me, you know?
Yeah.
Well, and then go ahead.
I was gonna say, and that's what, and so you have to find those little victory moments. Like
Yeah.
sometimes authors will talk about their white whale markets. That's the market that they really want to get into, and they will that'll be the place that they submit first whenever they have a new short story. And one of my early dreams was to get into an anthology just so I could see my name in print that was printed by somebody else. And so when that happened for the first time, it was a really special feeling.
Yeah, I
That is
think
great.
if we don't take those moments to be excited, like, because what I understand is that, like you said, going back to what you said earlier, even people who've done this are really good at it are still getting more rejections than acceptance for the most part, right?
Yeah,
So
you gotta build up your rejection calluses.
I like that.
And it's
guitar.
I think it's important to remember that like you can't control a lot of your rejections. Like you can write a great story sometimes, but I mean, think of all the people who are writing a pandemic novel and then a pandemic hit.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
what are you gonna do?
Anybody that's been writing zombie short stories for the past 10 years.
Yep.
I will recommend to anybody to go out to either Clark's World or Strange Horizons. I'm sure there's other magazines will have lists of stuff that we don't want, and zombies is always at the top of the list. Everybody is zombied out and has been for a decade.
We can't control whether, like you said in the short story market, if they've just bought a similar piece to yours.
Oh, things that we can't control. My first ever pro sale was to Daily Science Fiction, and I was super excited. I was just going to blast Twitter with the link, and the very day that it dropped was the day of the Boston Marathon bombing.
Oh, no.
And so I'm not going to self-promote on that day or
Right.
that week.
Oh.
So yeah, and the world is going to do crazy things around you, and you just have to.
Kurt, can I ask you about? You said something that I really admire about your reflectivity, which is you talked about how you wrote flash fiction every week, and that there are only a few of those that you still can, and I quote you, stand to read. What is it that you've grown so much that you look back at your earlier writing and go, "Ooh, I should have,"
Well, I think this is common of a lot of writers, but as you grow in skill, you also grow in evaluative capacity, if those are real words that I just made up.
They are.
So
That's okay, though. I'm with it.
Or if you're learning a musical instrument, or if you are a computer programmer, which is also a thing that is on my resume, like there is no one in the world as bad at what you do as you from 6 months ago.
Okay, I'm living that. So I have to ask you a question because I feel like you have to help me with this. So is it possible at any time that your evaluation outpaces your skill? So you're like, I know this is bad, but
absolutely. That is it, and what really happens is that it's just two different skills that develop at different paces, and so you will get bursts of each. And so you will get a burst of development in your ability to create. And then you'll think, oh man, I'm amazing. Look at all this awesome stuff that I'm producing. It doesn't look like anything I've ever seen before. And then you will get a burst of evaluative skill. And you'll be like, everything is garbage. Why am I doing this?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Because I was like, oh, I'm definitely in the burst of evaluative skills. So I hope this helps other people.
The struggle is real.
Oh, thank you for that. Because so you just keep pushing through, then you just make yourself write the next story and hope at some point that burst of creativity comes back or development comes back. Is that right?
there's elements of that, but there's also elements of, when you feel stuck, try something new. Because like if you write science fiction and all of a sudden you think you're crap at writing science fiction, try to write a fantasy story, try to write a romance story, try to write a mystery or a horror story. Do something that will definitely push yourself, where you're not caring about the quality. You are simply doing it as an exercise.
And I want to make an analogy here, because I don't think it's made or enough. But to me, it reminds me of like working out and going to the gym. Because Kurt, when you talk about motivation and momentum, like that's me at the gym. Like I have to go every day. It doesn't matter if I suck. It doesn't matter like how good I do when I'm there, but I have to go there. And if I break my momentum, that's when the problem happens. But
it's the
go
power
ahead.
of habit.
Yeah. But then there's also like, okay, I've doing squats for a while. You get bored of squats. You don't want to do squats anymore. So you try a different thing. But the only way you're going to get better at the sport is by doing it. And you might plateau. Plenty of people plateau. And the only thing to do is to keep doing it, try something different. I do judo, and plateauing there is really frequent, really common. People tend to have like a favorite throw that they're doing. And, you might plateau at the throw. You might be like, I am so bored of this throw. You try a different one. Just, whatever you can do. If you're in the gym, you add more weight because you're growing, or, whatever it is, just to keep, like you said, keep the spark there.
Yeah, it's and gamification is another thing that helps, where you're really it's less about what you're doing than the fact that you are, racking up experience points and leveling yourself up.
I like it. And we forget sometimes, just because you're writing, plenty of people don't write to get things published. And that's okay.
That is absolutely true. That is absolutely okay. I know there's a friend of mine in my writing group that writes just for himself. And, he's going to retire in a few years from his job. And when he does, he will go on to write the great American novel. But for now, he is just entertaining himself and stretching and, developing that skill.
I am curious on what kind of drew you to science fiction. We'll start there.
It's so speculative fiction is, and spec fic meaning, science fiction or fantasy or horror, depending on who's defining it. Of those, sci-fi really speaks out to me more, just because it is really about humanity's capacity to grow beyond itself. And I know that there's a lot of crossover between sci-fi and fantasy, particularly. I mean, the classic example is Star Wars, which is basically sword and sorcery fantasy, but dressed up as sci-fi. But very broadly speaking, fantasy tends to be focused on how the universe is affecting a person and how the fates are guiding a person. And sci-fi tends to be more about how people are affecting the universe and guiding the universe. And obviously there's worlds of counterexamples. And I feel like those barriers are becoming thinner every day. But I do like the idea of there is something inherently optimistic about, we are human, what can we accomplish? And so that's fun. Also, gadgets are cool, toys are cool, robots are cool. I mean, dragons are cool too, but
I 100% like, okay, so we'll see if this stays in the episode or not. I got into like a massive discussion the other day with one of my friends about Star Trek and the difference between the Star Trek shows and the newest Star Trek movies. And you sound like you have an opinion.
Oh yeah. The J.J. Abrams Star Trek.
Yeah,
Definitely adventure
Exactly.
fiction, much more along like the classic like Flash Gordon type of stuff. It
Yeah.
feels much more at home in like the Star Wars milieu, which is no surprise that J.J. Abrams then went on to make Star Wars. That was
Yeah.
much more
Like,
what his interest is in.
yeah, Star Trek historically, the show has always been like adventure in terms of like discovery and what are humans and I guess humanity like broadly, all of the aliens kind of thing, what they're capable of, these like violence was very infrequently the answer.
Yeah, I've heard a number of people say that, and I loved that first Star Trek movie that Abrams did. It's a really good movie. It's not Star Trek though.
Yeah. And I'm like, I love the kind of discovery aspect that can be in science fiction, right? Like you said, like pushing the bounds of like what are humans capable of, going out and how are humans impacting the world around them and what are we doing and what can we do?
And it's funny because I think I read more fantasy than I read sci-fi, but I much prefer to write sci-fi.
I have a theory about that.
I'm the
Do
same
share.
way, Kurt.
Because okay, so here's my theory. As an engineer, because I'm also an engineer, I find there has to be there's a sweet spot for me for consuming science fiction, both in media, like visual media, and in writing. And I can't consume science fiction where the science is wrong. It drives me insane. I pull out my own hair. I'm like, what are you talking about? This breaks. This is no.
Yeah, what's the Binti series? I can't remember the author. Google Nedia Corafor. The Binti series is kind of about how math is magic, and I read the first novella in that series, and I'm like, this is a really well written story, and I can't stand it because numbers don't do that.
Yep. So I can't read that. But then I dislike stories where you sometimes find it in hard science fiction where it's about the technology. Like it's less about the story and it's more about the technology. And I'm like, okay, but I still need characters and I still need like things to happen and I still want to root for people. Like I like the phasers and stuff isn't what makes Star Trek Star Trek.
It really depends on how it's handled. I love the movie Hackers, and it is a completely unrealistic depiction of hacking, but it never pretends to be realistic. I mean, in that movie, hacking is magic. And they demonstrate that pretty early on. And if you're on board with that, then it's a fun ride.
That's a good point.
Do you think it's
go ahead.
easier to suspend belief in fantasy than it is in sci-fi?
I don't think it's necessarily easier. I don't think it's hard either. I think it really comes down to how it's executed by the author. Well, I have a degree in mathematics and have a lot of experience working with computers. So those are the things that I'm familiar with. My wife has a degree in art history. And so I remember watching her. We were watching the movie Troy with her and her best friend. And throughout the beginning, they're like, yeah, no, those ruins, those shouldn't be next to each other. Those are like 50 miles apart in real life. Yeah. So, what takes you out of a story is really going to depend on your background.
I think there's also like as an author, like if you're in the fantasy, you set the own rules to your fantasy, basically 100%. And then it's just a matter of being consistent with the rules that you set. In sci-fi, it's still there, right? Like you set the rules, but you're also more or less governed by the rules of the universe.
I mean, more or less, but there's an awful lot of science fiction that has faster than light travel, and the universe does not have the universe doesn't have a whole lot of rules, but that's one of them.
Yeah, but at least they're consistent.
and that's exactly it. I mean, you hand wave what you're going to. If you get enough stuff right, then your audience will trust you.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this faster than light travel is one of those things where it's like the implications of going that fast are such a pain in the butt to deal with that people just don't want to.
Yeah. But if you're going to have a story that takes place on multiple different planets and you don't have a way to travel between them, well, then that's just boring.
Oh yeah. But I mean, I thought Interstellar did it pretty well, talking about like, oh, we're gonna go really fast and time is an issue now.
Yes. And Wormhole. And yeah,
Yep.
I love Christopher Nolan movies. I'm excited for Tenet. So, but I think he does a really interesting thing where, so this is something that comes up in my writing group, is that especially new writers are very focused on plot over character. And I love to bring up the movie Inception because that's a very plot forward movie. And it's a movie where the plot elements are very visible. But the core of that movie is a very relatable personal story. You know, this main character, Cobb, he wants to get his kids back and he has to deal with the trauma of the loss of his wife. And that is what is motivating him. And that's something that anybody can understand. And the moments that it's happening, it feels like it's kind of interrupting the plot for it to happen. But if it wasn't there, then we wouldn't have any investment in that character and then we wouldn't care about the plot.
I like that point because especially with that movie as a great example, there were a lot of people who didn't necessarily felt like they understood the plot the first time they watched it. And yet everyone loved, not everyone, but many people still loved the movie anyway. And it's because they made a connection with the character. Yeah.
And, you know, compare that to a movie like Primer, if you remember that indie sci-fi movie from, I don't know, 50 or 60 years ago, which is another one that's very plot forward. But a lot of the appeal to that movie is look at how twisty and curvy our plot is. And nobody comes out of that understanding it. But but that was one that I watched and I was like, yeah, that was fine. Not one that I got excited about because again, I didn't have a strong character journey that I was glommed onto, and the extent that I was able to follow it at all in the end when it was just all crazy is because I was like, okay, well, I know what this character is trying to do, and I can at least watch him try to succeed or fail.
Well, I'm trying to think like when we remember stories, do we remember the plots or do we remember the characters?
Oh, we remember the plots. This is, again, why it's very much a new writer mistake is that there's a tension between the stuff that's visible and the stuff that's important. And plot is very visible, but it's not all that important. It's really just the framework that you hang your character conflicts on. And meanwhile, the character stuff is very important, but it's not visible. And so if you have a movie or a book or something that has very weak characterization, you can tell that it's not working, but you don't know why.
Another writing gem from Kurt today.
Yeah.
I can talk about this stuff all day. I probably should have mentioned this in my introduction, but I lead a local writing group here in St. Louis, and we really try to. It's part discussion. It's really more discussion than critique circle, and I've been leading it for years now. So I spend a lot of time thinking about story structure and team dynamics and the proper way to do dialogue. In fact, the presentation that Morrigan saw at Flights of Foundry was one that I had developed for that writing group. And so when Flights of Foundry reached out and they were like, hey, do you have something that you could do? And I'm like, well, I've got this presentation.
So I missed it. So can you tell us and the people who missed it what that was about and maybe like a key takeaway?
Yeah,
there's more than one.
There are many key takeaways. The entire presentation should be available as a video at some point in the next couple of months. So people that didn't get to see it should be able to see it eventually. But it was a demonstration on line editing, and what I did was I took the first paragraph of 50 Shades of Grey and took this very systematic approach where we're going to start at the paragraph. And we're just going to move sentences around and really focus on the flow of information. And then we're going to go in line by line and then tweak all of those sentences. And it was using a framework of first, we're going to edit for clarity. because if you don't understand what's going on, then nobody cares. And then we're going to edit for word economy after that. Am I getting the most bang for my word buck? Am I making the best use of my audience's attention budget?
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you real quick because that is an edit that I think a lot of people skip, and I am very passionate about this part of it. So sorry.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to circle back. And then finally for aesthetic, because words should be fun, writing should be a joy. And so over the course of the presentation, I basically dissected that paragraph and moved it around and did some word tweaking and ended up not making a lot of changes, but they were very targeted changes in order to make things flow better, in order to make things to make, improve word choice, that kind of thing. And it comes out quite different.
And what I really appreciated about it was how a lot of the times your choices for clarity also enhanced flow. And so many times you would say in that, we're writing these long, complicated sentences that we're attached to because we think they're pretty, but they're confusing our reader. And if we're not writing so our reader can understand, then we're missing the point, right?
Yes. And since you asked, the one takeaway from that presentation is make your sentence do one thing.
Yes. Yeah.
So word economy is my degree is math and economics, and I tend to think about things very transactionally. So when I think about word economy, you've got, if somebody picks up your book or picks up your short story, you've got about 200 words to convince them to keep reading, because by the time they get to the bottom of that first page, they will have made a decision about whether or not they're going to turn the page. And so that's why we place so much emphasis on openings. And I think people tend to overvalue opening lines a little bit and undervalue like opening paragraphs a little bit. But the point stands that you are really trying to get the reader invested in the story enough to read one more page. And the easiest way to do that is character. Like I mentioned I read slush. If I get through the first 200 words or so of a story, I need to know, who is the story about? What are they trying to do? And why should I care? And if I don't have answers to those questions, I'm not going to keep reading.
That's a really good point. And I want to, whether this makes it in the episode or not. So I've done like 5 edits of my first chapter because I'm awful at first chapters because there's so many things that you have to do. And I can't believe, so I gave you my first chapter for the critique thing, and then I don't know if you remember your feedback, which was that
I do.
Which is
I loved the opening. It just didn't really connect to the character or the rest of the story.
Yeah. And my character had no agency, and the whole first chapter, she made 0 decisions, and I got out of that, and I was like, what have I done? Like, how did I not notice this? And I went to Morgan because she's read my first chapter, and she was like, this is a great chapter. And I was like, Aces doesn't make any decisions. And she's like, yes, she does. And I'm like, no, she doesn't. And this is not related to any. And she's like, oh, crap. So I had to rewrite the whole thing. It was like, man, sometimes you just need that oh, duh moment.
And it was so great because we had worked so hard on like flow and how beautiful the word choice was. And it was well crafted, I was super proud of. I was so excited that she was going to share it with people and the cheerleader in the background.
Yeah, it was beautifully crafted. And that's why you really have to do this kind of outside in approach and make sure that you've got the pieces that you need before you start polishing them too much.
Yeah. It was just one of those, like, what have I done? Like, how did I do this? All right, well, back to the drawing board. Well, I got to fix this issue.
There was somebody in my writing group that we were doing a critique of her piece just the other night, and she realized that the conflict that was set up at the beginning was resolved 2/3 of the way through, but then the story kept going, kind of resolving other things. And it didn't even resolve. It just kind of petered out. And it was one of those, everybody was like, it feels like it runs out of steam. And it wasn't until somebody articulated that we were like, oh yes, that's exactly what it is. You resolve this first question that you ask gets resolved too early, and so we just don't care about what happens after that.
I love that. Does your audience care? How are you keeping them invested? And just to recap what you said for our listeners, in a short story, you're saying in the first paragraph, you should have who is it about, what is it about, and why should I care? And then for a novel, you'd say the first page, or do you also think it should be in the first paragraph for a novel?
In the first, honestly, the distinction between a chapter or a scene and a short story is not that big. Like the main difference is that in a book, you don't resolve everything by the end of the chapter. There should be things that are left unresolved, but a chapter should still have an arc. It should still have a character who is motivated towards something, and it doesn't have to be the first paragraph, the first 3 paragraphs. But again, by the end of that first page, even with a short story, I know whether or not I'm going to turn the page and read the second.
I've been dying to ask you this question, so I'm going to throw it out. You talked about how you have an economics degree and a math degree, and you focus on the economy of things. And when I read your short story, which I loved, I could see that with your setting. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about, you write sci-fi, and yet your setting choices were, I would say, kind of sparse, and yet I could visualize the whole thing. And
what story are we talking about?
Oh, I gotta read it. I gotta learn the name. See, now I get embarrassed myself.
No,
you were talking about the one on the skate pod with the
skate
banana
pod
cake.
I love that. Yes,
Ms. Figglebit's Home for Wayward AIs. It is my favorite thing that I've ever written
because it's brilliant.
If you're going to consume that, definitely listen to it, because the narrator Matt Dovey takes this thing that I am super proud of, and then he just elevated it.
So true. I did both. And I would say as a writer, do both. Read it and then listen. That's how I did it. And it was awesome.
Yeah, I love his read of that. The setting is very sparse. It's really much more about stepping back 3 feet. The story is about a hospitality robot named Charlie who was fired from his post at the United Nations. And by fired, we mean decommissioned, because there was an incident where it was a big dinner and something had gone wrong with the dessert, and so he had risen to the occasion. He'd stepped up and in order to make this caramelized banana upside down cake to serve to the dignitaries, and it was a disaster. He almost started 2 wars. The people were terribly sick, very nearly killed the Secretary General with his terrible cooking. And so his goal at the very beginning is he is trying to make this cake, and it goes badly. And that is his goal. And so this is obvious. If it weren't obvious, this is a humorous piece. But there's a lot going on in this story in the background. And that involves the United Nations and these other robots and possibly some sinister plots. But Charlie is trying to make a cake, because if he can make this cake correct, that will atone for this horrible mistake he made. And he will have his mantra throughout the get upset, I get better. And so if he can just fix this mistake, and that is all he wants. And
it's a redemption.
And I love it.
It is a redemption, and it's because I love redemptive heroes. And so I don't remember where I was going with that sentence.
We're talking about setting.
Your
attitude towards setting.
Setting is one of those things that in this story it definitely took a backseat, because that was not a lot of focus, and it's really only 2 locations, and also because you try to keep the word count down, whereas something like an epic fantasy in a secondary world is going to be much more. You're going to have a lot more emphasis placed on the setting, and honestly, that's what epic fantasy really going there to get. That's part of the experience of reading epic fantasy, is to experience this new world that's very different. Whereas, Miss Figglebits is set in a world that is, there's a lot of robots going around, but apart from that, it's not all that different from the world that we would recognize. And the setting is really more cued to the reader than presented. So, like, I came up with this title when I think the movie version of Miss Peregrine Home for Children there were trailers out for that. So that, but when you hear the formula, Ms. Blank's home for adjective plural noun, like that creates a setting for you. What kind of a place this takes place in. And so that's one thing that I didn't have to really deal with in the story.
Yeah, I thought that was neat that you showed me a powerful futuristic story where a setting was really, like you said, cute and understated, which I thought was great. And yet the humanity of these robots really took center stage. And I'm going to ask one more, Molly, and then I'll give it to you. But
No, you're fine.
One of the things I loved about your writing so much, and I'm going to teach that story to my students, is I loved how you could talk about aging and not fitting in, which are very human problems, and apply it to a robot and make it so lighthearted. Do you have any tips for how you do that? Is that just kind of natural to you, or is it something you had to develop as a writer?
Well, aging and not fitting in is something naturally to me. That was a joke.
Sorry, you cut out, or I would have laughed.
So, people read stories because we want to see people that we like struggle with something and then succeed. And we relate to people that have struggles like ours. And I mean, kind of the fun of writing AIs is that because the way that I wrote AIs is not how AIs function in the real world. And it's not really realistic to how an AI would function in the near future. But it is a conceit that allows you to have something that's human-like, but not. And that gives you a lot of freedom to kind of push on what you can do. You can make them kind of like exaggerated humans. Like, this is a character who is focused on helping other people to an extent that would not feel realistic if it were a human. But because he's a machine, he's programmed to do that, and so we accept it.
I really liked Morgan. Did that answer your question before
Yes.
I take?
Yeah. Thank you.
I loved how even with a short story, like that was Morgan's takeaway. It was like talking about fitting in and aging and stuff like that. And for me, I really gravitated to the part on communication and miscommunication. And we think we're being clear, like we think a recipe is clear, but it never says to peel the bananas, And as someone like you, Kurt, I did, when I started learning code, I didn't learn how to code until I was 19. And you literally have to tell the computer every single thing.
So are you familiar with the peanut butter and jelly sandwich experiment?
Yeah.
When you teach children about coding, you ask them to instruct you on how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and then you be as obtuse as possible. So if they tell you
that in 7th grade, and it's hysterical.
Exactly. If they tell you to put the peanut butter on the bread, then you take the jar of peanut butter and set it on top of the loaf of bread.
Yeah, they love it.
And that is what programming is like.
And I loved that kind of, that look into it. And it wasn't like overt, like, hey, I'm educating you about programming and about how when we communicate, we have assumptions based on what we think people know. It wasn't overt like that, but I still really enjoyed that aspect of it.
Yeah, it's little things like that help sell that I know what I'm talking about. And if the reader believes me that I know what I'm talking about on the stuff that's not important, then they're much more willing to go with me on the journey of the stuff that I'm totally making up, but that is important.
I like that. You build credibility.
So that way, when I have a story fueled by hand wavium, you trust that I actually know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Or at least suspend belief because it's fun enough
That's true.
that you're willing to go
joke,
for the ride.
a good joke will cover a multitude of sins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, we all watched the movie Avatar. We all were there when they talked about unobtainium, and we all continued to sit in the movie, and we all knew it was bad. But
Well,
there was enough else happening in the movie that we were like, fine, whatever.
The hilarious thing is that unobtainium is an actual scientific term that is used to refer to exactly that sort of thing. It is completely possible that real scientists in that real situation would call that stuff unobtainium, but it's so ridiculous that it takes you out of the story anyway. It's the Tiffany problem. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
I'm just dropping all kinds of things.
Explain
here.
it though for the audience.
The name Tiffany dates back to like the 15th century or something like that. But if you had a piece set in the 15th century with a character named Tiffany in it, nobody would believe it. It doesn't matter that it is realistic. If it doesn't feel realistic, it still takes your reader out of the story.
That's tricky in so many ways. We all run into that in our stories, I feel like.
And it's all over the place in movies. Like there is no reason that a sword should make a metal on metal scraping sound when it's pulled out of its scabbard. But if it didn't in a movie, it would feel wrong.
Because we're programmed to expect that now. Mm-hmm.
Explosions in space.
Yeah, they make noise.
Or we going back to Star Wars, because everything goes back to Star Wars. Why do the laser cannons recoil? They're firing light.
I do like that they don't bleed, like when they get their limbs cut off, and they probably
just them or something, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I like that aspect. Like probably they just didn't put in blood in the original because they were like, ooh, this is
PG rating. We need
PG rating.
PG. Yeah, we want.
Well,
we want to.
Why the orcs all have black blood in Lord of the Rings is so that it doesn't look like real blood. So that way they could be a lot more gory with it, but still get a PG-13 rating.
Look at this. Now I know.
True facts.
So, Kurt, I want to kind of start wrapping up, and you've come a long way in your career, and I kind of want you to. What would you say to yourself when you were just kind of starting out? What would your advice be if you could go back and talk to the young version of you?
Advice to young Kurt.
Yes.
Separate bathrooms is the key to a successul marriage.
You're gonna invest in Google.
You meant advice about writing.
But I have to ask about the bathroom thing. That's not real.
That's I did not have a marriage end because we didn't have separate bathrooms. No, but I do stand by that. Separate bathrooms, key to a successful marriage.
Separate sinks at very least. I miss when I used to have a separate sink from my husband. Love him to death, but that was better.
Men are so gross. We're the worst. I think just this is not short pithy advice, but I feel like a lot of new writers, and this was definitely true of me when I was a new writer, feel we get a lot of our storytelling chops from film and from television, and they're different media. They have different storytelling languages, and so read more and read critically and see what other people are doing that works. One of my early aha moments was reading Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, and there's at the end when they're riding a raft on top of a sheet of water on top of a lava flow out of a volcano. Spoiler alert for a book that's like 178 years old. That it wasn't talking about how like there were bursts of lava that were missing them by inches. Instead, it was really talking about just feeling the oppressive heat and how it was so much more internalized. And that was like when that clicked, I was like, oh, you can do that. That is how you experience it. Because I'd also just read The Hobbit. And in The Hobbit, it has lots of moments where like they escaped from the tree and the wolves like bit at their feet but missed them by inches. And I'm just like, yeah, that's not very interesting. But taking those things and really focusing them on the character's internal experience of the story is a lot more resonant with readers. So you kind of have to separate it. The other big one that new writers is dialogue. In dialogue is how you convey information to the audience. But in prose, if you want the audience to know something, you can just tell them. You're the narrator. So you have to treat dialogue as a type of action. It has to be motivated. It has to relate to a character trying to achieve some kind of goal, or else it feels artificial.
But I mean, that's a really good point, because when you look at film, movie, TV, the only way to communicate information to the reader or to the consumer, the watcher, is either like background clues or dialogue.
Yeah, it's a much different
Medium.
language. Yeah, that is used in order to tell the story. And I love movies, but I don't write movies. And people get very focused on dialogue and blocking, and like that's all there is. Like, no, there's more. Like, you don't describe if you have a character in a setting, you don't just describe the setting. You have the character describing the setting through their eyes, because that gives you more internal information about the character.
Mm-hmm. I really wish someone would have told me that before I wrote Designers, because all my edits have been about that. So that's brilliant.
It's a hard lesson to learn. And it's one of those things that is, and again, it's one of those things that is really important, but not always visible. But the nice thing is, once you finally figure it out, you get that aha, galaxy brain, mind blown kind of thing.
Yeah.
This is just making me feel really smart, because I just did my little semi-sode last week about the difference between film and books, and about like you've talked about internalizing, and really it was about the 21 senses that humans have, and how you can use that to make your reader experience the world with your writer, or sorry, with your characters. And I feel, yeah, I'm just going to live in this really smart feeling right now.
I was not paid to say this. Molly was smart on her own.
It happens occasionally.
Molly, do you have any other questions before we let him eat his dinner?
I don't think so. It's been a joy talking to you. I think, yeah, I love talking about writing craft. I love hearing people's thoughts on craft, on storytelling. It's really interesting to me. So thank you for talking with us and for giving us so much of your time.
Oh, absolutely. This has been a lot of fun for me. Thank you for inviting me. This is my first time ever speaking on a podcast.
Yay!
So, achievement unlocked.
Tell our readers all about, or our listeners, all about where they can find you, where they can read your work, how they can support you and learn more about your career.
Yeah, so I have a Twitter feed and I have a website. I have a newsletter. I am at Kurt Pankau, KurtPankau, on Twitter. I also have kurtpankau.com. There's a page of all of my writing that's out there in the wild. My most recent publication was in Daily Science Fiction. My next one coming up is going to be in Unidentified Funny Objects, Volume 8. Yeah, very, very excited about that one. But yeah, if you like, follow me on Twitter, sign up for my newsletter. I promise not to spam you. I send out like one thing a month, and I talk a lot about my hobbies. So, board games and music and silly stuff like that.
Thank you so very much for your insights and your time, for kind of breaking down everything from, how the process has started to thinking about where it's ending, and especially for teaching me about short story market. I didn't really know anything about that. So today has been really exciting and just given me so much to think about. I love it. Thank you.
Well, again, you're welcome. This has been a lot of fun for me. I can talk about writing all day, and I really people level up. So hopefully this will be useful.
Kurt, one final question for me, talking about leveling up. We occasionally, when we remember, try to kind of end our podcast by giving people a writing exercise, or some little thing that they can try to do. Do you have any sort of exercise that comes to mind for our listeners?
Oh, I can think of a couple. But the one that really did the most help for me was, again, when I talked about just writing flash fiction every week for 2 years. So that's your assignment for the next 2 years. No, but set yourself a goal, set yourself a deadline, and write something. Write something that you don't care about because it's an exercise, because it stretches you. Write something that you don't know how to write, because you will learn something in that.
Well, thank you. Morgan, you want to take us out here?
I do. So I always end with something I'm grateful for. So obviously I'm grateful for having you on the podcast. And but I have to shout out, I just have to say this because it's in my heart. So it has to be said. I am so grateful. I had my 20-year-old horse had a healthy baby girl this week, and it like snowed and rained, and she's healthy and happy. And I just had to take a minute to be grateful for all the healthy people in my life that you take for granted until you're like worried about that. And so I just wanted to say that because I'm just really grateful for that. And obviously, Kurt, I'm super, super grateful that you came onto our podcast. Molly, you're up.
Yes. I'm grateful for that too.
Kurt, do you want to say anything you're grateful for before we sign out?
Yeah, I know this is a really trying for a lot of people. And so I'm in a work situation where it's very easy for me to work from home. And so my family has been very fortunate through all of this. You know, it's been emotionally difficult, but you know, our lives are at least stable. So that has been very forward in my mind for these last few months.
Yeah. So I hope at home, if you're listening to this, you have something that you can be grateful to, and we're sending our positivity and good writing ideas your way. And if you want to learn more about the Semi-Sages, please follow us on our website at semisagesofthepages.com, or check us out on Twitter at semiof, or Molly.
Yeah, just, that we're on the social media. It's everywhere. And if you forget and you can't find us, like Morgan said, just go to the website. It has everything there.
And if you really like Kurt, please, which you do after this, obviously, please check him out on Twitter. He's also on our Discord channel, and his writing is really amazing. So take time to check him out and support him. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Semi-Sages of the Pages. Music used in the introduction was the song 5 Armies by Kevin MacLeod, which you can find at incomptech.com. It is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0, which can be found at creativecommons.org/licenses/by/3.0. Whew, that's a wrap.
Kirk, tell me how to pronounce your last name so I don't screw it up.
Pankau, skillet bovine.
Pankau. Okay. I love it because
Don't feel bad. Everybody gets it wrong.
I don't want to screw that up. And Molly, remind me, this is not a regular. What are we calling these?
I don't know. This is just an interview. Bonus episode.
Okay. That sounds fantastic.
So, Kurt, I don't know if you know this, but the catchphrase of our podcast is, we don't know where we're going, but we're having an adventure.
Nice. Excellent.
And it's really true. You get to have this behind the scene look. Oh, yeah. Hey, what are we doing? I don't know.
I feel like that's true of most things and most people. So